When it comes to swimming nutrition, there is no one more knowledgeable or qualified than Greg Shaw. He is the sports dietitian lead for Swimming Australia and has worked with swimming for 20 years. He is an ex-swimmer, but graduated as a sports dietitian and ended up working with the British team, with marathon swimmers back in 2005, and also with our Australian swimming team, both pool swimmers and open water swimmers. He's done many research studies and has written many research papers, but in particular, he's written a paper on the nutritional considerations for open water swimming. I had the pleasure of working with Shori at the Australian Institute of Sport during my time there, and he has kindly given up his time to talk to us today on the podcast about open water swimming nutrition. Welcome to the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast, the show designed to serve you up evidence-based sports nutrition advice from the experts. Hi, I'm your host Taryn, accredited practicing dietitian, advanced sports dietitian, and founder of Dietitian Approved. Listen as I break down the latest evidence to give you practical, easy to digest strategies to train hard, recover faster, and perform at your best. You have so much potential, and I want to help you unlock that with the power of nutrition. Let's get into it. Introducing you to the one, the only, Mr. Greg Shaw.
Hey, Taryn, thanks for having me on.
You're welcome, Shori. I can't call you Greg Shaw. It just sounds too formal. Are you cool if I call you Shori on the podcast?
Yeah, no dramas at all.
So thank you so much for giving up your time to chat to me about open water swimming nutrition. You are the man, coming from a swimming background and working with swimming for pretty much the entirety of your sports nutrition career. There is no one better to talk to us about open water swimming than you. Like, you literally wrote the paper on open water swimming. So what I wanted to get your thoughts on today were just some of the nutritional considerations that we need to think about when we're swimming open water, but a bit longer than triathlon. So people listening are triathletes, and the longest they'll ever swim is 3.8 Ks for an Ironman or 2.4 miles. There's not a lot that you can do in that sort of distance. It's more about what you do before and afterwards to then ride and then run off the back of that. But a lot of athletes are starting to go a bit longer and doing things like Ultra 355, which has got a 5K open water swim, and things like Ultraman, which has got a 10K open water swim. So when we're stepping up to those sort of distances, what do we need to start thinking about differently when it comes to nutrition?
One of the kind of real seminal papers in swimming nutrition, and also, now open water swimming, it came in the late 80s with a guy called Dave Costal at Ball State University, and they did a really cool study where they kind of did high-intensity swimming, and they did muscle biopsies, and not of the legs, but of the upper deltoid. So anyone who's had a muscle biopsy of the leg, the deltoid's a whole different experience. It's a smaller muscle group. It's highly glycolytic, so you use a lot of carbohydrate to generate propulsive force or contraction force. And so therefore, in swimming, where we're looking at glycogen depletion, we're really talking about the arms, because most people are arm dominant from a stroke perspective. And so therefore, you don't want to use your legs in a triathlon if you don't have to. So very arm dominant. And they showed that 50% of the muscle glycogen could be depleted in as little as 3,000 yards. And that's, kind of around about threshold or slightly above threshold work. So they did kind of repeat hundreds, 30 of them. And then they went a bit further and went 60 of them. And, did the biopsy again. And they showed that, you're around about 90% depletion after about 6,000 yards. So it is capable of depleting muscle glycogen in less than 5K. But, with techniques like muscle glycogen loading and management of effort, you can finish a 5K quite easily without muscle glycogen being performance limiting. The challenge with that, though, is when we step up to 10K, particularly at the intensities that most of the guys that I work with, complete a 10K, muscle glycogen becomes really performance limiting. And so, exogenous carbohydrate or ingesting carbohydrate from gels and fluid, becomes really, really important. And so we put a lot of time and effort into that, and not just about volume, but about the quality of the feed. I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's really easy to kind of drink high concentrated sports drink and take it out of a cup. But the challenge then is what do you get in your actual mouth? What do you swallow? What do you actually absorb? And so, if we're looking at trying to feed at really high carbohydrate rates for highly carbohydrate requiring muscles, like the arm muscles, which are highly glycolytic, then we're looking to push the boundaries of what is possible from a carbohydrate ingestion perspective for those guys at 10K. Coming that down, bring that intensity down from a triathlete perspective, there's probably not as much need to be that aggressive as we are. Like an example for our bronze medalist at the Tokyo Olympics, Karina Lee, we pushed 120 grams per hour from her. So she consumed about 240 grams over the duration of that race. Some would argue that's kind of really high and probably not used, but in an event like the Olympics where we're trying to drive oxidative glycolytic pathways as hard as we can, we're trying to get as much carbohydrate from an exogenous source as possible. So that took a lot of training. That took a lot of science from a carbohydrate form perspective, took a lot of additional acclimatization, because the other component with something like Tokyo was it was 30 degrees in the water. So she was swimming in a bath. Your kind of intensity goes up again. And so your carbohydrate usage goes up again. So there is the possibility to push that. But then, if you're moving through really cold water, and you're moving well within your kind of physiological capabilities, the requirement to feed becomes a lot less, and being more manageable with your volumes and your concentrations is definitely something that, should be considered by a triathlon, particularly a recreational one who's doing something like a 10K as part of an Ultraman.
Yeah, solid. That is huge amount of carbohydrate oxidation while you're swimming. Did you do any testing to know how much you used or what a gut tolerance was for things like that?
So from a gut tolerance perspective, perfectly fine, and took a long time to do that. So probably about 6 months worth of training. The type of volume that Karina was doing as well prior to the Olympics, she needed to ingest carbohydrate to be able to support her energy availability and her performance requirements. And so, it becomes a really simple decision to put carbohydrate into training sessions rather than in shorter distance swimming, 100 meter training. The need for carbohydrate in sessions is probably a lot less. Turning up well stocked and ready to go is important, but, ingesting large amounts of carbohydrate during a training session, you just don't use it. It just becomes excess glucose, and, you then have to deal with that from a physiological perspective post session. So, but yeah, she did a pretty fantastic job.
That's amazing amount of fueling, and particularly in hot water. One of the questions I do want to ask you and pick your brain on, though, is sweat rates during a swim, during an open water swim and a pool swim, because it's so different to cycling and running. So do you know roughly what that would be in terms of hydration for somebody doing a 5K or a 10K open water swim?
Yeah, it all has to do with water temperature. Water is 23 times more thermally conductive than air.
Boom.
And so therefore, your ability to drop heat to the water is really efficient at lower temperatures. So, most open water races that we do in, say, Europe, we're at 20 to 22 degrees water temperature. So when you're racing in that temperature, there's no issue with hydration at all, because the body will conductively lose heat and doesn't require the convective loss from sweating. Once we get up around the 26, 27 degree water temperatures, that's when sweating becomes a little bit higher. So, if we look at the pool data around sweat rates, most of the pool data suggests that at kind of moderate intensities in a 27 degree kind of pool, you're losing around about 100 to 300 mils of fluid an hour. So really kind of low compared to other terrestrial sports where it's hard to lose heat to the atmosphere. And hence why, when you talk to swimmers or people who swim, if they're chasing their hydration and they're drinking a lot of water during training, what's the one thing they talk about is that, you have to either get out of the pool to pee or you pee in the water. And so are you an in the water peer, or are you a person who gets out to go to the toilet? That's the common one. And often that's because you're drinking more than what you need. You're not losing much. And so therefore, we always kind of consider fluid in training, particularly indoors, pools south of, say, the northern coast of New South Wales, where temperatures actually don't change too much in the pool. Fluid during training is probably not too much of a concern, similar to racing. But once you get over that 28 degrees and the pool temperature starts to rise, and this goes for training as well, there becomes a bit of a tipping point, and that tipping point's at around about 28.5 to 29 degrees. And once you go over that tipping point and intensity increases, you get a decoupling of thermoregulatory control. And so the body starts sweating, and quite profusely sweating, trying to lose heat by convective measures, but it can't do that because there's no evaporative cooling that goes on. And so, you get a decoupling of the thermoregulatory capabilities. And so you get sweating, but without the convective heat loss. And so, in water temperatures above 29, you can be seeing quite large fluid losses over that period. So in our open water races, particularly for something like Tokyo, we use slushies, we use hyperhydration, we use sodium loading. We were ingesting that 240 grams of carbohydrate came from around about 1.5 liters of fluid. That was temperature control. So we ensured that the temperature was 14 degrees Celsius so that there was a perceptive cooling effect, as well as being not too cold that you couldn't ingest that volume of water in a really short period of time. So some of those types of things, when we go to races where it is hot, we actually prepare for, we train for, we identify that well in advance. We've done work with some of the leaders in thermoregulatory control, Ollie J and Sam Chalmers, to come up with heat stress indexes so that we can identify, races that are going to be challenging for our swimmers, and we can prepare for that. And so, we do sauna work, we do heat acclimation work. We actually have a protocol where we can heat the pools up to 32 degrees, and we undertake 10K sessions in those types of swimming environments. Now, in summer, for our guys, a pool in Noosa that's outside without a lot of thermoregulatory control, and it's really humid, it's really hard to keep it below 30 degrees, which is fine for learn to swim and fine for the average, retiree who's doing their 1K on a Wednesday morning. But for anyone who's doing some hard training, it really becomes claustrophobic and overwhelming. And so, nutrition becomes a big part of that.
Do you know what the sweat rates are roughly around those sort of temperatures? Obviously, it would be individual, but if it's sort of 100 to 300 mils in cooler environments.
It can get up to the 800 to a litre. So someone could lose up to 2 litres over that type of session, particularly as you go above 30 degrees. The water is still pretty conductive at that temperature, and there's still enough of a thermal gradient to dissipate heat. When we do core temperature monitoring in those types of races, we rarely get over 40 degrees. So just recently in World Championships, we did some core temperature monitoring of our 10K swimmers, and Chelsea Gubecka, our silver medalist in that race, she tapped out at around about 39.8, I think. So, there's definitely evidence in more terrestrial activities of high intensity athletes where, you're in the 40s and above. So even though the water temperatures are getting up there, it's not performance limiting if we prepare appropriately for it.
And do you know if there's any data in swimmers like triathletes that would swim in a wetsuit?
So again, for us, we don't have that challenge because we can only use wetsuits below certain temperatures, and they're 18 and 20 degrees. So, it's now changed where we can't use a wetsuit above 18 degrees. So, when you're in those types of water temperatures, the wetsuits, they're actually for thermoregulatory improvement. And so you're not losing heat to the water to become hypothermic. And so there's not a lot of data around recreational activities where, you are above 22, 24 degrees from a wetsuit's perspective. I can appreciate that, a triathlete, might do a couple of K in it. I haven't actually ever come across this, but doing a wetsuit in a 10-kilometre race with, water temperatures above 24 degrees, I would assume would lead to, a good amount of sweating because you just don't, you don't have the ability to dump it to the water in the same fashion. But I would expect that it'd likely be limiting from an arm fatigue perspective, because as you add the wetsuit and you go longer, it does add significant fatigue to the shoulders from a neuromuscular perspective. And even our guys who are well practiced at wearing a wetsuit have different fatigue patterns off the back of a 10K versus a suited 10K. Just by covering the torso, even there's additional kind of effects off the back of the day after where they're significantly fatigued. So you'd probably be more sore from wearing a wetsuit for 10K in warm water than from dehydration.
Yeah, crazy. I actually hate wearing a wetsuit for that reason. I just feel so restricted and your deltoids sting out faster. And I would wear a no-sleeved one, but interesting that you say that they're still fatigued without it.
Yeah, in open water swimming, we're not allowed to wear a sleeveless because of the temperatures we're dealing with. And obviously with triathlon, it's a bit different. So, that would then negate some of the shoulder issues. But again, even just covering the torso there, pulling down on the traps is fatiguing in a different way.
Yeah, I actually find, because it makes you so much more buoyant, my whole form is different and I get a sore back because I'm so buoyant in the water, whereas other triathletes use a wetsuit to make them more streamlined.
Yeah. And it's the same with the super suits like that we saw around 2009 with our wetsuits. You know, it doesn't make the top guys better. They actually hate using them because it actually brings the poorer swimmers up to them. And so the packs are more congested, it is rougher, and it really suits bigger bodies, more muscular bodies, more dense bodies. So, you know, they can then deliver force with higher buoyancy, which means that they don't fatigue as much. And so, you know, it does change the dynamics of the race. And, you know, there is a nutrition implication of that. If we are using those certain muscles more aggressively in a wetsuit, then we've obviously got to be more aggressive with our, you know, kind of nutrition support to make sure that fatigue isn't the limiting factor in performance.
Cool. Love picking your brain, Shuri. There's always like some really good gold nuggets that I pick up on. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that.
That's what I'm here for.
Are you a triathlete sick of fumbling around in the dark with your nutrition? Is nutrition the missing link in helping you reach your goals? And do you want to maximise your training efforts and level up your performance? Of course you do. Come and join me for free at Fuel School. It's a free 3-day live and online nutrition training week. And I've designed it to give you the nutritional edge in 2024 and lay the foundation of your day-to-day fueling and race nutrition. It's on the 14th to the 16th of January, 9 a.m. Brisbane time, so Australian Eastern Standard Time every day, which is 3 p.m. PST, 5 p.m. CST and 6 p.m. EST on the 13th to the 15th of January. To register, head to fuel.school. Yep, www.fuel.school. Whether you're a seasoned triathlete or just starting your nutrition journey, this free event is your opportunity to learn from an advanced sports dietitian and triathlon nutrition specialist and transform the way you approach your nutrition for 2024. Fuel.school, it's free. I'll see you there. Okay, so if we're looking at, say, 10K open water swimming, definitely glycogen depleting, particularly for somebody that might be wearing a wetsuit. So something like carbohydrate loading would be useful and beneficial.
I think so. You know, it gives a better capability from a fatigue resistance perspective and means that the ingestion of carbohydrate during the race is going to be more effective because you're not chasing losses as much. It does come down to then a feeding availability during the race, like what's the frequency and the opportunity of that. You know, if we come back to the open water, hot water races, you know, we just published a paper off the back of the Olympics, which kind of went through how you might manipulate the environment and the race layout to be able to support performance in higher water temperatures. And so traditionally in open water races, when we first started, they were point to point. So you start one point and you swim to another and you have feeders in boats that could go out and kind of feed you as you needed. And there were some regulations around how frequently you could feed them and zones and all those types of things. And then as we evolved into, you know, an Olympic discipline, we definitely looked at, you know, how you would deliver that. And it was 2.5K laps. So you really only had potentially 3 opportunities to feed in that race. And in that instance, it's really hard to consume large volumes of carbohydrate, you know, in short durations of time. So a typical feed for an open water swimmer, maybe 5 seconds. They'll pick the bottle up, they'll roll on their back, you know, and depending on the intensity and the aggressiveness of the race, they may try and ingest it quickly. Some of them might be calm because they're at the lead of the race and kind of do a bit of backstroke, you know, while they listen to what the coach has got to say and they have a bit of a drink and then they throw the bottle back and then they roll over. But it's a short period of time. It's not like you can take your hands off the handlebars of the bike and open a gel and suck it and make sure you squeeze all of it out. And those things just aren't capable in open water. So as you reduce the lap size, the frequency of feeding opportunities increases, which is great if you want to manage heat because you can get more fluid in, you get more carbohydrate in. And so therefore that influences the capability from a carbohydrate perspective and a feeding perspective. So I think it comes down to, well, what is the feeding opportunities in the race? And, you know, if you're doing something like a Rottnest Island swim, you know, 19 kilometers across the channel there in Perth in cool water, you know, when you can actually pull up again next to the boat and feed as often as you want, well, then, you know, you can really be creative with how often and how much you take in during the race. And carbohydrate loading beforehand is probably not too relevant. the situation where you start at one point and you go to the next and there's no feeding available at all, or there's only one window of opportunity, well, then carbohydrate loading becomes really, really important. So, and I think that's the one thing for me that, when I was an early career dietitian, I thought, yeah, I know all this type of stuff, and, I just tell them what to do and it'll all be fine and we'll do the maximum amount. But the one thing that I've learned now, and one of the strengths of our program from a swimming perspective in Australia is, the ability to understand what performance takes and be really diligent with our planning and preparation for that. And I think that can be done by all levels of athlete, whether they be recreational or elite, and taking the time to start at the end and work your way back. Start at what you want to achieve and how you want to do it, and then work your nutrition back. Like, that's the money. If you've got an opportunity to spend $1, spend it on planning and preparation, because that will be where the dividends and the multiples will return in race.
Love it. So if somebody's 6 months away from, say, a 10K open water swim, what are the sorts of things they need to start thinking about to prepare for that?
Yeah, I'd think about, what's the environment going to look like? Is it going to be a saltwater race? Is it going to be a freshwater race? So anyone who's done an open water race will know that a freshwater race is harder than a saltwater race, because a freshwater, you feel like you're fighting against it. You sink in the water. There's no buoyancy associated with it. Whereas a saltwater race, you feel like you're sitting on top of the water a bit more. It's actually quite a nice environment. You often can see the bottom and there's lots of nice things going on. So I think planning ahead is really important, like getting an understanding of what implications that's going to have. So even things like, if it's a freshwater race, salty feeds are probably going to be something that's going to be enjoyable and possible. Whereas, if you're doing a saltwater race, salty feeds will not be your friend, because you're probably ingesting salt water over that period as well, and it makes you feel pretty disgusting from that perspective. So sweeter, more concentrated feeds might be actually beneficial in that style of water. I think, trying to understand the water temperature, as you've said, whether you're going to wear a wetsuit or not, and then go, what time do I want to swim? How much of a percentage of my, kind of maximum intensity will that be? And then you can do some calculations around how much carbohydrate you're going to need, whether that be from the feeds that you get from a feeder, or, what you're going to need to do from a glycogen loading perspective to be able to kind of ensure that that's not a problem. Even things like considering what kind of stroke rates am I going to be holding in the early parts compared to the last parts. They're all going to influence, the requirement from a carbohydrate and a fluid perspective, and then you can practice. So to give you an instance, with something like Karina, example at the Olympics, we did 5 swims in a 32-degree pool at 10K with, kind of a really specific pacing strategy prior to even going to a hot water camp in Darwin and doing our heat acclimation work. So the more comfortable you are with the process you want to deliver, the easier it's going to be on the day.
So do you recommend doing the distance in a swim? Because a lot of triathletes will not do like a 180K bike ride, or they won't run a marathon in training. But a lot of swimmers swim way beyond what their actual event is. Like, you think about 100-meter swimmers, they swim 20Ks a week. What do you recommend for a 10K open water swimmer?
Well, our guys have a range of different volumes that they do. They can go anywhere from about 65K a week up to 100K a week. Some even go further than that, depending on the distance that they look at. But I think it comes back to the fact that the mechanical load of swimming is less than running and riding. There's no weight-bearing component to it. So therefore, it's actually quite easy to do the volume without the mechanical stress and recovery required between those sessions. So the one thing, we definitely have seen a change in the way people train is around intensity. Like, we have swimmers that will hit close to their pool speeds in the last 100 to 400 meters of a 10K race. And so that comes from, just repetition and practice of that. But I think more so, and this is the same for all nutrition, and I'm sure this is something, you do in your education as well as, you hear in your podcast all the time, familiarization with the nutrition strategy just makes it so much more achievable. And it just means it's autonomic in regards to, you don't have to think about it. You don't have to worry about the consequences. And I think one of the things I find funny at times, and this is even at an elite level, is, an athlete comes to a race and, they're like, I'm now going to do this. I'm like, okay, well, let's see how this goes for you. And it goes pear-shaped, and, it's like, oh, I didn't think it was going to happen. Like, did this happen and this happen? And it was because of these reasons. It's like, well, no, it's not. It's because you just haven't practiced it, and the race played out differently to what you thought it did. So I think, as I say, planning and preparation is really key in open water as it is with any other nutrition strategy.
Practice, 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 always. No point doing anything new on race day. It's a golden rule of racing, right?
Yeah. And that comes down to even the form in which you consume the carbohydrate. So the amount might be similar, but, whether it be in a dilute drink, whether it be from a gel versus a gel flask, the type of bottle that you use. I know our swimmers put a lot of thought into the type of plastic bottle that they use to feed from. They don't want a mouth that's too big because the fluid gets delivered too quickly. They don't want a mouth that's too small because it comes out too slowly. It takes them too long. They want something that they can actually squeeze and crush some of the actual volume out and help force it out, but they don't want something that'll fall apart when they grab it. So we're starting to get more regulation around the form of the bottles that we use, rightly so from an environmental perspective. There's an expectation now that all our feeding bottles and cups are biodegradable. And so if they do get left in the ocean environment, it's not a consequence for the environment greater than a couple of days. But with that, we've had to work with, the kind of producers and suppliers of those products to say, well, we don't want the mouth too big. We wanted this, make sure you put a lid on it. That's important because if we're shaking it up before we provide it to the athletes, well, then without the lid, things go everywhere. It's easy to disregard those as they'll be right on the day, but the more you can plan and prepare for that with your, nutrition professionals who are working through some of those things, the better you will be and the more comfortable you will be in that environment. And it just doesn't become a challenge because there'll be a bunch of other challenges going on from an intensity and a tactical perspective, particularly for us, that you need to deal with and respond to.
So many good practical tips there. Do you have any tips for troubleshooting if someone in an open water swim, even just an Ironman distance event, swallows heaps of salty water, and how do you come back from that?
Yeah, I think it's being calm and thinking through the problem logically. From an athlete perspective, oftentimes you see panic in that situation where, if I swallow too much salty water, well, then I need to counteract it with more fresh water to flush it through. Whereas the body's pretty capable to be able to deal with some of that stuff. And it's oftentimes you see the consequences drag on or be greater because people overreact to it. So I don't know if any of your kind of listeners have seen this, but when we feed on the end of a long pole and we've got a cup on the end of it and, there's arms going everywhere. And quite often someone will smack a feed out of the feeding cup. And so an athlete may rock up and there's nothing there. Or as they go to put it in their mouth, someone knocks it out of their hand. And so they've got to be adaptable enough to realize, okay, this isn't the end of the world. I'll get a feed on the next lap. You've got that capability built in to it. And, they've got to be able to roll with those consequences. And contact is a big one for us, where we've had broken eye sockets. We've had pieces of goggles lodged in eyelids and stuff. And oftentimes we'll have an ophthalmologist as a part of our emergency medical teams, because it is, like a stray elbow, a hand, you've got glass around it. Like it is something like that. So, it's the same with nutrition, just being able to absorb it, reset and work with your feeder to have contingencies in place. The other one I think is really important, and have a way of communicating with your feeder for us that isn't verbal, because, like with us, when we're moving through the feed zone, lots of yelling, lots of screaming, your head's underwater, you might be able to see them, but you really can't hear them. And so how do you communicate tactical information or also requirement to your feeder and vice versa that is, effective? Again, from a recreational perspective, that may not seem, useful, but if you kind of go, well, I need goggles, I need new goggles, I need new cap, I missed a feed. Can you go with the second feed rather than the first feed? You've got to have a way of being able to get that across, because that's where panic and overreaction sets in.
Yeah, and time too. Like if you're really going fast and looking to win, that's a big time saver too.
Yeah, just that calmness.
Oh, so good, Shori. Honestly, my mind's like spinning already. So what I wanted to do was get you to hang around if I could. We're going to hit pause on the podcast, sorry guys, and dive into some of the real practicalities of feeding somebody in a 10K open water swim, because I've got a lot of academy athletes preparing for Ultraman Australia next year, and they've got no idea what they're doing, and you are the best person to help just calm their nerves at this point in the game so they can do some planning and preparation. So thank you very much for joining me, Greg Shaw.
Thanks, Darren.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or want to share with me what you've learnt, email me at podcast@dietitianapproved.com. You can also spread the word by leaving me a review and taking a screenshot of you listening to the show. Don't forget to tag me on social media at dietitian.approved so I can give you a shout out too. If you want to learn more about what we do, head to dietitianapproved.com. And if you want to learn more about the Triathlon Nutrition Academy program, head to dietitianapproved.com/academy. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to helping you smash it in the fourth leg. Nutrition!